Welcome. This is the next workshop in the 2023 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candace Black, and I am your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. We would like to welcome you to Getting Ready for Implementation for World Language Teachers. With September 2023 fast approaching, the time has come for world language teachers to prepare to implement the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. What steps can teachers take now to be ready and confident to enact the revised standards? What is the best starting place? In this session, presenters will offer practical advice, strategies, and resources that world language teachers at all levels can use to audit and align their curriculum and build capacity to confidently implement the revised learning standards. Before I introduce our presenters, I'd like to thank the following individuals for their help in assisting with this workshop: Kimberly Harder, Barbara Patterson, and Wenxiao Zhang. Our workshop presenters today are Dr. Joanne O'Toole, Dr. Lori Langer de Ramirez, and Bill Heller. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Joanne, Lori, and Bill to begin this webinar.
Thank you, Candy. Welcome to our webinar, Getting Ready for the Implementation for World Language Teachers. We have one more webinar remaining in our 2022-2023 series that will be offered next Thursday, June 6th, entitled Discover Authentic Resource Gems in the World Language Wakelet with Barb Patterson. Also, coming this summer to a venue near you, we will be offering 2-day summer collaborative unit design workshops, focusing this time on Checkpoint B. As always, CTLE credits will be available for all of these learning opportunities. You'll find the link in the PDF file of these slides that will be put in the handouts folder immediately following the webinar. You may already be familiar with our webinar symbols. We ask that you keep your mic on mute through the entire webinar. You will see a blue thought bubble symbol when we take a moment to think about something. When you see the green chat bubble, you can enter questions or comments in the chat box. Please avoid using the chat box unless you see the symbol. Finally, when you see the yellow folder icon, it means that you'll be able to find the document related to the slide in the handouts folder, the link for which I've placed in the handouts folder several times. And I'll give it to you one more time. I can find it, my cursor here. Oh, well, we can't. All right. Our goals for today are: I can identify ways to build on my previous successes with the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. I can identify shifts that will align my practice with the revised learning standards. I can identify essential resources for implementing the revised learning standards. And 4, I can identify professional learning opportunities to prepare myself for implementing the revised learning standards. How I define success in my practice as a language teacher has evolved over time. When I began, my goal was just getting all my students to pass the Regents exam. Then it was getting as many as possible to that 85% level on the Regents. From there, I measured success by increasing and maintaining enrollments in Checkpoint C dual credit courses. And now many of our programs are trying to increase the number of students earning the seal of biliteracy. Many of these are still good and worthy goals and solid measures of success. So let's take a moment to think. How do you define success in your own professional practice? What are the hallmarks of success for your district world language program? Let's think about that for a moment. What are your hallmarks for success? With the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Languages, with well-defined proficiency ranges for each checkpoint, and the tools to create meaningful communicative and cultural contexts, we might consider some new or additional ways of measuring success. In crafting our own mile markers for success, we might ask ourselves some new questions. Does my teaching allow more learners to achieve a greater degree of proficiency. Faithfulness to a well-defined performance indicators, language functions, and contexts in our standards documents should help us make more effective and efficient use of our time and make more purposeful instructional choices. Does my teaching allow learners to see what they can do with language? Teaching for proficiency also helps us to clearly communicate learning goals to learners and provide more actionable feedback so students can own their proficiency gains and realize what they are able to do with the language. Success can breed more success. Does my world language teacher build greater empathy by promoting the understanding and knowledge of diverse cultures? Using a rich variety of authentic resources and engaging in meaningful conversations allows the voices of the cultures who speak our target language to speak for themselves and creates space for empathy, understanding, and appreciation. So what are some strategies to build on our current successes and expand our vision of what might be possible? One strategy is to clearly communicate to the learners about what proficiency means. Early in the year, empower your learners with the language of proficiency. Teachers often use the metaphor of the path of proficiency or scoops of ice cream on an ice cream cone to explain actful levels and sublevels. They create anchor charts or bulletin boards for reference throughout the year. Let the students know what novice and intermediate communicators can do with the language. Reinforce that proficiency focus every day with learning targets that focus on language functions. And offer feedback based on the performance indicators so students recognize what they can do and how they can level up to the next step of their proficiency journey. Another way to build on our success is to take the instructional units that we already teach and audit them using the lens of the revised standards and performance indicators. In the folder, we have a unit audit template that you can use to take a look at your current units. Some teachers like to take a favorite unit that they love teaching to audit first, to look for tweaks to make the unit even more effective and engaging. Other teachers prefer to start with that unit that they dread teaching every year. Sometimes the audit process can help us identify why the unit is so challenging and provide us some insights for enhancement. If you're required to use a textbook series, this unit audit can help you analyze your textbook chapters for alignment with the standards. Let's take a closer look at the unit audit process. The first step of the unit audit process is to determine the language functions from each of the revised standards that are introduced, practiced, or reinforced in the unit as it's currently taught. In the next column, you can list the instructional tasks in the unit that correspond to each standard. In this way, it's easy to see if all the standards are being sufficiently addressed in the unit. In the next column, we make note of the formative and summative assessment tasks that correspond to each standard. This can point out how the standards are assessed and whether or not the assessments align to the language functions we identified in the first column. And the final column gives us a place to make notes of any gaps we find or to jot down any ideas or brainstorms that occur to us as we work. At the bottom of the audit sheet, we have some additional considerations to ponder. They include, does the unit use rich and up-to-date authentic resources? Do the images and resources show diverse cultural representation? Do assessments align with objectives driven by language functions? Does the unit theme engage students by integrating multiple topics? Again, there's a place for us to note any gaps or ideas that emerge. Another suggestion for building on our success that can follow a unit audit is to write unit learning targets as can-do statements. I know that many times in my own practice, my unit objectives led with verbs that related to unit learning products and did not lead with language functions. In addition, they were often wordy and filled with teacher jargon. A good unit level can-do statement begins with the words "I can," then a language function verb, and then the context in which communication will take place. They lead with the language function. They provide the communicative context. Ideally, they're written in learner-friendly language so we can communicate to the learners what their expectations are. A unit-level can-do statement allows for multiple ways for the student to demonstrate, and it allows us to accommodate within our class a range of proficiencies so that students can experience some success at whatever level of proficiency they might find themselves. Another strategy is that by using fresh and current authentic resources, we could upgrade our thematic units to align with the revised standards and provide an authentic and engaging communicative and cultural context. In the handouts folder, we have a helpful guide with tips to locate and select authentic resources. In addition, NYSED hosts a curated archive of authentic resources on a platform called Wakelet that you will see referenced on this slide, and the webinar next Thursday will treat in more detail. The Wakelet has sections devoted to languages taught in New York State schools, as well as links to resources that have suggestions for making the most effective use of authentic resources. The Wakelet is a goldmine for finding the best curated collections of authentic resources and is a real time saver for busy teachers. Once you've aligned thematic units to the standards, you can begin to map out each course using a basic curriculum map template. This map creates an at-a-glance overview of the entire course. Curriculum maps make it possible to assemble a big picture view of instruction. Then those curriculum maps can be used to conduct two important course audits. In the first course audit, teachers use the curriculum map they've created to check that all of the language functions are addressed, preferably multiple times within a course, to allow sufficient practice and repetition of the structures necessary to carry out each language function in a variety of contexts so that proficiency can develop. The second course audit checks for the breadth of topics included in the course. Using rich thematic units creates contexts which allow for purposeful recycling of high-frequency vocabulary for proficiency to develop. Another way to build on our success is to tap into the power of collaboration. Make the effort to create time and space to work with colleagues and reap multiple benefits. These collaborations might include collaborations with school colleagues through PLNs, collaboration with district colleagues, participation in professional organizations, participation in social media groups, and participation in BOCES regional groups. Another way to build on our success is to communicate, educate, and advocate with our administrators, particularly with those who do not have a background in language teaching. We've created several tools to help you in this endeavor that are on the State Ed website and in the handouts folder. And they are all contained in what is called a Comprehensive Administrator's Reference Guide. The reference guide lists concrete ways that administrators can support your programs in two principal venues. First, there are suggestions for how administrators can support teachers in their professional learning by building awareness of the standards, providing time, and allocating funding for world language teachers to build their capacity to implement the standards. Secondly, also in the Administrator's Reference Guide, are suggestions of ways that administrators can provide for advocacy, time, and funding for world language teachers to work together so that they can successfully implement the standards. Also included in the Administrator's Reference Guide are guides to help administrators identify effective practices specific to world language teaching. What good teaching looks like in a world language classroom may not always be readily evident to an observer unfamiliar with effective research-based practice in language teaching. These guides can be used as a basis for rich pre- and post-observation conversations. And finally, you can build on your own successes by taking charge of your professional learning. In the handouts folder and on the website is what we've called the countdown document that provides many suggestions for developing your own plan for implementing the standards, along with links to many resources and recorded webinars on the State Ed website, all in one place for your convenience. Now, Lori will share with you some practical advice from her deep reservoir of wisdom and experience. Lori?
Thank you so much, Bill. And you're going to hear a lot of suggestions that really resonate with what you just heard from the ideas that Bill shared. We're building on successes and we're making shifts over time. In my over 30 years of teaching, I have seen many, many shifts, and some of them have been absolutely joyful and some have been challenging, but they have all moved my own practice further along and made me a better educator, and I'm thankful for them. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of my own practice and how I look at making shifts. So we're going to talk a little bit about what I used to do, and then move towards what I do now and how I have made those shifts. And hopefully some of these ideas will be helpful for you as well. The first bit of practical advice I have is one that I take very close to heart and practice every day, and that is small chunks and small steps. So really breaking things down into small daily tasks. I'm a list maker. I love scratching things off my list. And I find that when I'm able to take something and break it down into a small chunk, something doable, a deliverable, it is much easier for me to go ahead and do that task. And it sits with me in a different place than if I had tried to do it all at once. It gives me time to think about things. The idea of writing things down helps a great deal. It takes them out of my head into the practical world of a notepad, or if you're doing it digitally. But I would really recommend breaking things down, shift from that worry that looking at that big iceberg oftentimes invokes, and move to that smaller task. You can try something, reflect on it, and revise. Again, I love writing things down as much as I'm a digital, a lover of all things digital. I do like writing them down. I'm an analog person when it comes to taking notes and having journals. So have a look at that image, think about it, think about how we break things down and we chunk things for our students and how much that makes a difference. And this is the time to be breaking things into small, manageable tasks. Another bit of practical advice is another shift, that shift from thinking about mastery as the goal, moving to proficiency development and benchmarks. And we have so many helpful materials and resources to look at. One of them, of course, is the performance indicators, and helping students to understand what they're able to do at any given proficiency level, helping you to see what they're able to do, moving away from the idea that, you know, I taught that, they should know that, towards what can they do in this moment. Also looking at the continuum of control. This helps for me in my own practice as well, and thinking about what things I have conceptual control over. So I just really understand a little bit the concept, to partial control. Maybe I'm getting it, but not consistently, to full control. And so those shifts in terms of thinking about what students can do in my classes help a great deal to move from that mastery idea as learning being a fixed and something that is black and white, to something that is far more nuanced. This is another shift that helps a lot, and looking at those proficiency, those benchmarks can help a great deal as well. Another bit of practical advice from my own teaching, that shift from focusing on form, the vocab and the grammar. We all remember those units where we are directed by a particular vocab set, maybe a unit on transportation or food or the parts of the house. Or grammar. Maybe you had a unit that was preterite and imperfect, or the passé composé. So those were old frames that we used to use to guide our curriculum development. The shift is moving from those forms, or the focus on form, to focusing on meaning. So really looking at the language functions as a driving force in designing our units. What you're seeing here is an example of a PACE lesson. PACE is a model where you present grammar, you draw attention to a particular grammar form, you then co-construct the rule, and you extend that particular grammar rule. This is a picture book that I love to use with my students about the capybara, and you'll see on the top right some structures. These are actually some commands that I wanted my students to know. So they came out naturally in the course of this story. We drew attention to it by drawing that box around it. Students then, and me, we co-constructed the rules for this grammar point. We then extended it by asking them to create their own rules for the classroom. This shift has been really incredible for my own teaching, and also for watching the way students engage with grammar and vocabulary topics. And it's something that, again, going back to my original recommendation of doing things slowly and in small chunks, you might try one lesson and try this model out, and then reflect on it and think about the things that worked and revise and come back to it. But take it in small chunks. But that shift from that focus on form to meaning is a big one. This is going back to what Bill was talking about. We're going to hear a lot of talk about authentic resources throughout today's session. So another shift in my own teaching has been a move from teacher-made or commercial interpretive texts to authentic texts. As someone who considers herself creative, I used to love to write stories for my students. I used to love to write picture books and all sorts of materials for my students. And I have moved from that desire to create the materials, and I've channeled that energy and excitement and creativity into finding authentic materials. And so moving away from that teacher-created text in some cases about themes and topics that the students were studying, to material that's available online, but finding just the right reading, just the right image, just the right audio file that really gets the lessons moving. This one is some information, a reading about superheroes in Latin America, or Latinx superheroes. That is really, really a fun reading. And it replaced some readings that I wrote myself oftentimes. I also love to use infographics, so those really play together well. The other reason why authentic texts are so valuable, and why I have shifted my own practice from writing things myself to using predominantly authentic texts, is that it is really centering the voice of Latinx authors and folks who create content, and centering their voices rather than my own. And it brings in an incredible amount of cultural information to my classes. And I can still be my creative self by finding them and building them into really exciting thematic units. Another shift in my own practice has been moving from separate skills to integrated modes and skills. So this may resonate with many of you. I used to have a portion of my lesson that was about reading, and maybe a section on my assessment that was about listening, and all of these skills were really separate. And I've since moved to this integrated model where you have the modes of communication connected with the cultural standards. So everything is moving back and forth and really overlaying each other. So you have students listening and speaking. There's a cultural theme. So that integrated modes and skills provides a lot more nuance and a lot more creativity for students. And it really feels more real world, because in the real world, this is how we communicate. We speak, we listen, we may read, there's some cultural context, and it's all intertwined. So it's really made for some much more interesting and exciting and real world texts and tasks for my students. And then, as you can tell, I do love to design things. I do love to work on my own. I used to love to write lots of things for my students because it fed into my own quirky interests. And that was very unique to me. And there's still room for that. But I do love to collaborate with colleagues. And I find that if you're able to do that, that is one of the biggest shifts that has made a difference for me in my own teaching. Some of you may be in small schools and may not have colleagues, unfortunately, but there are lots of ways for you to connect with the profession at large. This is one example right now. You're in a room with lots of other colleagues. We have presented many webinars, and you get to hear other people's voices, hear other folks asking questions. There are lots of other opportunities for ways for you to connect both in person and online. We do have many events such as book clubs and all different things. We also have a Facebook page where you can join. It's a group, and lots of good conversations happen through that group. So it's a great way to connect, and through other social media where other teachers of your language or languages are connecting and asking each other questions and sharing resources. And then, of course, professional organizations. So come out to conferences, connect, talk to people, ask questions. This, for me, has really made a real change in my own practice, and I am all the better for it. So these are things that I encourage you to consider when you can. And then finally, we've been talking about shifts and we've been talking about change, but it's important to recognize that not everything has changed. And Bill started us out today talking about building on our successes. So we are doing a lot of incredible work in our classrooms, and it's important to recognize that. And so this document is in your folders, and you can see the icon there. This is the comparison chart, and it's going to give you a sense for what exactly has changed and what hasn't. And you can see here this component. We still have two main standards. We have communication and cultures, so those are still there. We still have the same standards for students in all levels, so that's reassuring. That has not changed. So do have a look at this document and make note of the things that haven't changed. Make note of the things that have, and as I said, work with other colleagues, break things down into manageable chunks, and these shifts will be joyful when done with other colleagues. And I will pass this on then to Joanne to share her wisdom with you all.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you again to all of you for being here. So the question on this slide is, when do the standards take effect? And my sense is that you probably already know the answer to this because you've been listening to us for quite some time. But I do want to point out this September is when we will be officially launching the implementation of the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Language, a cause for celebration. We have been working towards this end for 2 years of professional learning and communicating with world language teachers across New York State. You'll see that it says the rollout is with Checkpoint A 7th grade. So if you have a traditional 7-12 program, 7th grade is the first of 2 years of Checkpoint A, then the 7th grade program is the first to roll it out this fall. If you have a FLES program or a program that begins before 7th grade, your Checkpoint A will start with whichever is the first grade level. In the case of programs that begin before 7th grade, your district can decide when you're going to get to the second year's implementation. And then this is a gradual rollout. We've learned lessons from other content areas. So 1 year at a time, we will be rolling out the standards, or the standards will be being implemented at each one of the subsequent grade levels from 8th to 9th to 10th to 11th to 12th. You'll notice that we have archived over time many, many resources that Bill and Lori have made reference to from the work that we've done in preparing you for the implementation. In addition, we're not going to abandon you. You will have ongoing professional learning opportunities and the development of additional resources. So, where do you find all of these resources? Well, the New York State Education Department's Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages has a web page called Standards and Guidelines. And the 4th, 5th, and 6th blue bar on that web page is where you will find the revised standards and key guidance documents, resources for teachers, and resources for administrators. And I point this out even though we have many of these resources in the folder for you today. There are additional resources on this webpage, and we're in the continuous process of developing additional resources to support you in your work. And so you want to be able to check back often. So just like Lori talked about the big set of tasks, I'd like to suggest that it's a pretty big set of resources. And as I mentioned, the set of resources is going to continuously grow. And you may be thinking, where in the world do I start with all of these resources? So I'm going to point you to 3 resources that I will call the 3 essential tools. So if it's just too overwhelming to you to work with all of these different resources that are available, these 3 will really help you get off to a great start. And they are, first, the New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. Now you'll notice that below the title, I have the words why and how. So what do I mean by why? Well, one of the things we know about each one of our learning standards is they contain language functions, and language functions are the purposes for which we have our learners communicate. In other words, the why of communication. The how refers to the skills, because every one of our 5 standards identifies which language skills, reading, writing, speaking, listening, viewing, receiving, signing, all of those are embedded into the standards. So just by using the standards themselves, we can identify the reasons we're having our learners communicate and the skills we're going to have them use to communicate. The second tool are the New York State World Language Proficiency Ranges and Performance Indicators that Lori already spoke of and that Bill alluded to when he was talking about what learners can do. And the performance indicators tell us and tell our learners how well we can expect them to perform, or the goals we set for their language performances according to the descriptors that are in this document. And the third document that is one of those 3 essential tools are our New York State World Language Themes and Topics. And they answer the question, about what? So we know why our learners are communicating, we know what skills they're going to use to communicate, and we know how well. But what are they going to communicate about? They're going to communicate about the integrated topics that come together to design thematic units of instruction. So with these 3 essential tools, we have everything we need to design a unit plan. So you can build a unit plan with just 3 documents. Bit of a celebration there. So what you have on the screen for the next few slides are screenshots close up of the unit plan template. And I failed to point out that on the previous slide, there was a little folder icon because we have put the unit plan templates that we designed from State Ed into the folder. You'll find one for modern languages, categories 1, 2, modern languages, categories 3 and 4, and classical languages. But all of them look pretty much the same in terms of the content, just the drop-down menus are a bit different. So in front of you, you see the unit plan context, which is the starting point of a unit plan. And the context is where we as teachers are identifying some of that core background information about the unit plan, from what language this is to teach, what course it addresses, how many weeks we intend to spend on teaching this unit, what proficiency levels we're targeting, the meaningful unit title, the anchor theme, anchor topic, integrated topics for communication, how we're going to describe this unit, what's our overview, and then what's the inquiry question that our learners are going to be able to answer throughout and by the end of this unit using their language. So let's take a quick look at how each one of these 3 essential tools helps us complete this entire unit plan context. So the learning standards, the why, the how, help us identify or help us describe the overview. What's the communication our learners are going to be having, and how are they going to do that? And then why are we communicating in terms of the inquiry question? What is it that we want our learners to be able to answer? The themes and topics fill a whole lot of these slots, from the title of the unit to the themes and topics and integrated topics. And of course, the unit overview will be describing what our learners are communicating about. And then the inquiry question also refers to what our learners will communicate about. And finally, the proficiency ranges performance indicators, or how well, help us specifically identify the proficiency checkpoint and proficiency target. And that inquiry question needs to be written at the appropriate proficiency level, so we know that it's a question that even if our learners are novices, that they can answer. So the next portion of the unit plan template includes the standards, the can-do statements, and acceptable evidence. So the standards and their language functions are listed in the left-hand column, the can-do statements in the middle, and the acceptable evidence at right. And you'll see that the learning standards themselves help us complete each one of the columns. The themes and topics, or about what, really fits into the can-do statement. As Bill pointed out, the can-do statements are the I can, language function that comes from the standard, and the context. And the acceptable evidence is measuring not only our learners' ability to carry out the language function, but how well they can do it. And we want to make sure it's aligned to the performance indicators. Further down, we find a place in the unit plan template for identifying our authentic resources and other materials. I don't really know what other materials you would choose, so we're not going to pay attention to that right now. But both the learning standards and the themes and topics help us identify appropriate authentic resources. the summative performance tasks. So these are basically the acceptable evidence, but at the unit level. They draw on all three of our essential documents. Because our standards, you'll notice there's a task for each one of the communication standards, and we're integrating with authentic resources, our culture standards. Our themes and topics will drive what we have our learners communicating about, and the proficiency ranges and performance indicators are going to identify the level to which we expect our learners to be able to perform in each one of these tasks. The language toolbox, where we do talk about what is the grammar, what are the language structures we expect our students to use to support the language function? What's the vocabulary we expect our learners to use to communicate about a given context? Well, again, we're drawing on all three of these essential documents. The learning standards, specific to the language structures and the key functions. The themes and topics, our vocabulary, and the proficiency ranges performance indicators. Again, what are the language structures that are appropriate for our learners' proficiency development? So now that we've thought about the resources and how we apply them and how we can, as Lori said, start small, try it out, reflect, revise. We want to continuously engage in those professional learning opportunities. And so just like State Ed has the web page for standards and guidelines, they have a second web page for professional learning. Again, make sure it's bookmarked because you will see all of the archived and the upcoming opportunities. The archived opportunities have been recorded. We have just completed a book study, but we'll be starting a new book study in the fall. We have the ongoing World Language Leadership Council that you can be part of, and we make sure that you know about other conferences that support your learning and ability to implement the revised learning standards. But it's a big set of opportunities. Just like everything else, we know it's almost oversized. Never quite big enough because people need more, but can also feel overwhelming. So you may be thinking, yikes, all these opportunities, where do I start? So I would redirect you to a document that Bill and Lori have both mentioned, which is that countdown to the launch document. Even though we wrote this for people to start in September of 2022 in preparation for September 2023 implementation, you can start at any time, and it walks you through one concept at a time, one document at a time, one recorded webinar at a time, so you can either individually or with others prepare yourself for the standards implementation. I had a wonderful conversation with a teacher at one of the NYSFL regional conferences back in the spring. And she said, you know, one of the things that I love about the recorded webinars is that I can go back to them over and over, and I can just watch little sections that I want to remind myself about. And so even if you have already started and you have already implemented, but maybe you're feeling like you just need a little bit more support or a little bit more reinforcement, I would also suggest going back and finding that webinar, like Lori was talking about the PACE model, and you're like, yeah, I'm a little fuzzy on that. Well, we have the grammar webinars from last February, and it was grammar part 2, where we talked about the PACE model, and you can go back to that little piece. So don't hesitate to utilize this document to guide you, whether you're just getting started or whether you just need to have that little extra reinforcement as you're preparing. And I just, again, I want to repeat what Lori said because I think it's so perfect. We call this a gradual implementation process for a reason. So even if you're teaching 7th grade or the first course in Checkpoint A, don't feel the weight of, oh my goodness, I have to implement it all and I have to implement it perfectly. Implementation is a process. And so give yourself that grace, try it out, reflect, revise, so that the next year you can do it even better. And we will all move forward together. So let's take a look at our goals for today one more time. I can identify ways to build on my previous successes with the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. I can identify shifts that will align my practice with the revised learning standards. I can identify essential resources for implementing the revised learning standards. And finally, I can identify professional learning opportunities to prepare myself or to reinforce ideas to implement the revised learning standards.